You think you're having statin adverse effects, but your doctor is resistant to the idea. Is there a way to decide? That's this week's topic. Stay tuned. Let's look at an example of something that happened to me that we can analyze methodically and see what we can deduce. I went on a business trip along the East Coast, so I didn't have any problems with jet lag or anything like that. It was the same time zone, but I was in the air for a good 2 or 3 hours. And on the way, I developed muscle pains and joint pains, especially in my knee. And I had just been put on a new statin, and I suspected that that may have been the cause. The next day at work, I couldn't even get up and down the stairs without basically using the rails and propelling myself because that's how much pain I was in. So on the way back to the hotel that evening, I decided to stop by the local CVS and I bought some CoQ10 thinking that might help. Well, the very next day, everything was fine. Well, there are several different ways of interpreting what happened. First, well, could be the statins did cause the joint pain and the CoQ10 mitigated. That's what I initially thought, but we have to admit there could have been some other cause and the CoQ10 mitigated it. It could be statins combined with another cause caused the pain and the CoQ10 helped. It may have been some other cause that was self-limiting and the CoQ10 had nothing to do with it and it had nothing to do with the statins. Or, some kind of combination of all of these things, statins combined with another factor caused the pain, it was self-limiting, the CoQ10 did or did not help. The problem is we only had one data point, and the other cause could have been that while in the airplane for several hours, I was subjected to a slightly lower atmospheric pressure because in an airplane cabin, it's like being at 8,000 feet elevation, and I'm used to more like sea level elevations. So there could have been all sorts of causes here. So let's take a look at what's known as the Naranjo Criteria, or the Naranjo Adverse Drug Reaction Probability Scale. And it gives us a series of 10 questions that we can go through and come up with a score and determine how likely it is that a particular drug, not necessarily just statins, but a particular drug is causing adverse effects. Fair caveat here, this is normally used in a more clinical setting and not all the questions here apply to an individual patient working just with a doctor. So let's look at these questions. Are there previous conclusive reports on this reaction? Let's go through what I went through. Well, yes, muscle pains and joint pains are reported as reactions to statins. Did the adverse event appear after the suspected drug was administered? Well, yes, that certainly was the case. I scored 2 points there. Did the adverse reaction improve when a drug was discontinued or a specific antagonist was administered? If we consider CoQ10 a specific antagonist, then the answer to that is yes also. Did the adverse reaction reappear when a drug was re-administered? I eventually got off statins, so it's hard to say on that question. It's really unknown. We can't give that a yes or a no. Are there alternative causes other than the drug? Well, yes, the atmospheric pressure changes in the cabin. You know how a lot of people, their knees can tell them when the weather's going to change. That's a similar situation, so we have to take a point off for that. Did the reaction reappear when a placebo was given? We didn't do that. I'm just trying to analyze what I knew at the time, so that becomes an unknown. Was the drug detected in any body fluid and toxic concentrations? There was no blood tests taken. Was the reaction more severe when the dose was increased or less severe when the dose was decreased? Well, again, this was a single instance. We weren't experimenting yet, so that becomes an unknown. Did the patient have a similar reaction to the same or similar drugs in any previous exposure? Yes, I did. I had muscle pains. Not often, but I did have muscle pains which were traced definitively to Lipitor. And then was the adverse event confirmed by objective evidence? And the answer there is no, because remember, we're just looking at this as an isolated incident. So you add up all these points and it comes out with a result of +4. Well, what does that mean? So that brings us to the topic of how the Naranjo score is interpreted. Here's how these can get interpreted. It's a definite cause if the score is over 9. Probable is 5 to 8. There's a reasonable likelihood the drug caused a reaction. Possible, between 1 and 4 points. There's some likelihood, but other factors may also be involved. And then doubtful is 0 or less. And you remember that our score was 4 on that. That says there is some likelihood, but other factors may be involved. And I think that's a fair assessment. So that's a start. But this is how this criteria can work. Again, in a clinical setting where maybe placebos could be administered, or a challenge and re-challenge and all that could be done, you'll get a more definitive answer. This is just how I applied it in that particular circumstance. So let's look at another case. I had stated in a comment somewhere actually that I had earaches that seemed to be caused by statins, and a viewer challenged me. They were a troll. They didn't challenge in a very polite manner. They gave a ridiculous counterexample which was meant to get us mad, and I just kind of sloughed it off and ignored it. But they had a good point, and that is, how do you know that these TMJ-like earaches that I realized after a year being off statins had gone away? How do I know that they were actually caused by statins? Well, let's assess that. Are there previous conclusive reports on this reaction? I have to say no. I have never heard of earaches being associated with statins, and I haven't found any papers on that subject. Did the adverse event appear after the drug was administered? The answer is yes. Did it improve when the drug was discontinued? What I had discovered was after I'd been off the statins for about a year, my wife had mentioned to me that you haven't had any earaches lately. And that's the first time I actually made any connection and thought, wow, those could have been caused by the statins because I've been off them for a year and I've been earache free for a year. Did the adverse reaction reappear when the drug was readministered? Well, we have to give that an unknown because by this point I was no longer taking statins at all. Are the alternate causes other than the drug? It's very hard to answer no to this one because there are always alternative causes. A lot of statin adverse effects mimic the effects of aging, so automatically we almost have to say there's an alternative cause in most cases. It could be associated with aging. Earaches I don't think are particularly associated with aging, but I don't know what else could have caused a reaction, so I'm just going to give that an unknown. Did it reappear when a placebo was given? Again, we weren't into that kind of investigation. We weren't checking for toxic concentrations in the blood. Was the reaction more severe when the dose was increased or less severe when the dose was decreased? No, we didn't do any of that kind of investigation. Did the patient have a similar reaction to the same or similar drugs? I have to honestly give that a no. This is one of those things where I had to go back over a journal, and I'm going to talk about journals in a moment. This now is something that happened 6 years ago, and I saw no records of earaches while I was on rosuvastatin, which was only a short while, so inconclusive there, or pitavastatin, which is the one that I suspected had given me the joint pains, but I didn't see any of those even when I was on pitavastatin. So they really only showed up while I was on Lipitor. I have to honestly say no, I did not have a similar reaction to the same or similar drug, so I can't get a point for that. And was the adverse event confirmed by objective evidence? Well, it's very hard to get objective evidence for pain. You feel it, you can tell your doctor you feel it, but there's no real measure of it from some external source for that. So these are the points that I got for this. And you'll see that it's a possible, but it was even less likely than the previous example we just went over. Only got a +3, and I'm satisfied with that. I felt when I first looked into this that for certain I was going to find that the knee pains were caused by the statin, but then when I went through an objective assessment of it, I have to admit it's by no means certain that was the case. Sort of the same thing here, though. I'm fairly certain that the Lipitor was causing it. All those zeros there, all those unknowns. The unknowns are the things that you could do further investigation and maybe figure more things out. There's no reason to do it at this point, because it's not going to change my decision on whether to take statins or not. It would just be an academic exercise, and I'm certainly not going to subject myself to taking high doses of Lipitor just to see if I get earaches. That's ridiculous. I'm going to have to be satisfied with this result. With limited investigation, we got it up to a possible. I believe that if I did further investigation, it probably was caused by this, but I'm not going to really go through any great lengths to prove that. There's really nothing to be gained by that. I also had cognitive and mood disorders, I would call them. So let's take a look at how those rank by this criteria. Are there previous conclusive reports on a reaction? Yes, there are previous reports of this in the literature everywhere. A lot of doctors deny it, but cognitive and mood problems definitely show up. Did the adverse event appear after the suspected drug was administered? Yes, it did. It took a while to develop, and that's always a problem. A lot of these adverse effects take a long time to develop, so it's very hard sometimes to pin them to the drug. Did the adverse reaction improve when the drug was discontinued? Yeah, I got off them, and I don't have these memory and mood and brain fog problems that I used to have. Did the adverse reaction reappear when the drug was readministered? Yes, I got off statins for a while, moved to another one. I went from Lipitor or atorvastatin to Crestor, which is rosuvastatin, to Livalo, which is pitavastatin. And each time, this brain fog, the cognitive problems, the memory problems, and the mood problems returned. Are the alternate causes? I have to give this one an unknown. It's very difficult, again, to answer this when you're not in a clinical setting and don't have some kind of full workup to figure out what else is going on. Did the reaction reappear when the placebo was given? No, we weren't in that sort of situation, so these next few didn't score us anything. Was the reaction more severe when the dose was increased or less severe when the dose was decreased? The answer to that was yes, because we did increase the dose of Lipitor when I was on it, and I did note, again, subjective is the problem, but by my own experience, it was more intense when I was on the higher doses. Did the patient have a similar reaction to the same or similar drugs in the previous exposure? Well, yeah, if we're talking about the latest instance of it, which happened when I was on Livalo, and it was the most intense when I was on Livalo or pitavastatin. But I did have these problems when I was on rosuvastatin and a little bit less on rosuvastatin, which makes sense because that is a water-soluble statin and is less likely to get through the blood-brain barrier and affect the cholesterol content of your brain. So it's not unusual that it wouldn't have been as intense on Crestor, but it was definitely fairly intense on Lipitor. And then this is an interesting one. Was the adverse event confirmed by objective evidence, like laboratory tests? The adverse event was confirmed by my coworkers. They noted to me, they spoke to me about it, about the mood changes that I was going through, but that's very difficult to call that objective evidence. In the case of the Naranjo Criteria, they're really looking for whatever the adverse reaction is, objective evidence such as, in the case of rhabdomyolysis, for example, breakdown of the muscle tissue, something of that sort. So I have to give this an unknown, even though I feel there was objective evidence in the sense that people outside of myself were noting it. It's not something you could put a number on. It's not something that you would convince a clinician was objective evidence. The score came out to be +8, or probable. If somebody asked me what single adverse effect caused you to get off statins, this would have been it. What are the advantages and weaknesses of using the Naranjo Criteria in this setting to you and your doctor? Well, first, it's most useful in a clinical trial setting. You notice a lot of those questions we couldn't give an answer to, they were called unknown. Well, in a clinical trial setting, you're more likely to be able to have the discontinue and re-challenge protocols in place, the use of placebos, maybe in a double-blinded manner, or at least blinded to the patient. These things are very difficult to do in just a patient primary care physician relationship. It's most useful when the adverse effects develop quickly and are not life-threatening, and when both the patient and the clinician, the doctor, have the inclination and time to experiment to get the answers. It's less useful if the adverse effects develop over long periods because it's so hard to say it went away when the drug was withdrawn. They may go away faster than they develop, but then how soon do they come back? You started a statin 4 years ago and you started getting a symptom now. Chronologically, the symptom developed after you started taking the drug, but long after. And that would be common with statins, but it also makes it that much more difficult to say there was a cause and effect there. It's less useful when the patient and doctor do not intend to use it for decision making. What's the point? For example, what would be the point for me investigating further to figure out if these TMJ earaches were truly because of the statin? It's not going to change my mind. If I found out that it wasn't and for some reason they happen to go away and we have no idea why they started in the first place, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to go back on the statins even if I find out that the earaches were not caused by a statin. And of course, when the placebo challenge is required to further refine answers and you're not able to do that sort of challenge, it's less useful. And finally, just don't use it if there's dangerous adverse effects experienced. For example, rhabdomyolysis. It may not have been caused by the statin, but it is a known adverse effect of statins, and it's life-threatening and it's very dangerous, and you don't want to play around and say, well, let's see if we can get a Naranjo score into the probable or definite category by taking this drug and see if my body tries to eat itself from the inside. I mean, that's ridiculous. In that case, prudence, I think, dictates that you just say, get away from that medication. So for my closing thought, first off, if you feel you're experiencing any adverse reactions, keep a journal of all your symptoms and conditions under which they occur. Their intensity, the statin dose, when you take the statin, like what time of day, if you're doing it every other day or something like that, anything you think that may be pertinent, and even anything else unusual in your health status, even if you don't think it's related to statin use. I did take a journal, but I wasn't that strict in recording earaches. I don't recall. This is stuff that happened 6 to 10 years ago. If I never made the connection in my mind, I may not have written it down, but I think what you would have to do is just write down everything that has to do with your health. Just a matter of data gathering. It doesn't matter what you think, well, this is ridiculous, I stubbed my toe and it hurts, that's got nothing to do with the statins. Fine, just record it. If you have a disagreement with your provider, do a self-assessment with what information you do have to see where you really stand from this Naranjo point of view. Remember, it's going to be incomplete because Naranjo categories and the Naranjo assessment is really more in a clinical setting, but you can get at least a first pass estimate with just your own experience. And if there's any reasonable way to fill in gaps in knowledge, such as discontinuation and re-challenge, discuss it with your provider. You don't want to be discontinuing the statins without their okay. You may get into a little bit of an argument with them, but if you can emphasize how important it is and get an honest answer. Stopping taking a statin isn't going to kill you the next day. It would be more of a long-term thing if there truly was a danger, because this is a maintenance drug. If your provider doesn't want to cooperate or go through the trouble or tells you that you're wasting your time, perhaps you are wasting your time with that provider and you may need to take a different action, if you know what I mean. So that's what I've got on this topic. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topics or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.